In the last presentation, I was talking about ritual and how rituals can have several different uses. They can maintain society, but they can also be used as protest as well, or to enact social change. The women's suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, the LGBT rights movement, all of these are examples of movements that incorporate different rituals to try to affect change. Anthropologists actually have trouble studying social change. When we talk about America culture or Tana Tarajan culture, it gives the impression that they're a certain thing that's just unchanging. So we need to ask, how do changes take place over time, and we need some other concepts to do that. So remember that culture and society are not bounded, and they're always undergoing changes. So we can't be certain that what we know when we do a study will be just as true in the future. This does really complicate things, and people tend to gloss over social change. But part of the anthropological project is to study humans, what it means to be human across time and space. So we're studying change over time as just a part of our discipline, and this is part of what makes us unique. We can think of social change as social action. And I have up here on your slide the actions of people that collectively and cumulatively reproduce or transform culture and society. We tend to think about it always as change when the term social change makes us think of change, but social action is a little bit broader because we have to recognize that it takes a great deal of effort and energy to actually keep social change from occurring. In other words, to maintain the status quo. So using the term social action helps us remember that there are different things we do that can reproduce or transform the society, but there's also things happening that maintain that society as well. An example is the civil rights movement in the United States. It's obviously an example of social change that occurred over time with a lot of effort behind it to create those changes, but there are still institutional barriers that have been put into place that prevent that social change from fully being realized in many ways. In other ways, those institutional barriers have been changed. But the fact that those barriers existed in the first place shows you that there is a lot of effort, a lot of social action put into place to even prevent change. So symbolic actions are one type of social action. And speaking about ritual in the last presentation, and rituals is a type of social action, myths, arts, literature, etc. And all of these reproduce the way participants see the world. They can also be used to transform how people see the world in many ways. They can be used as a form of social change or social action towards change. And so if we stop for a minute and just think about the ritual I described in the last presentation, a traditional Western-style wedding ceremony, we can think this through a bit. If you think about what's happening and the way people are arranged in a very conventional Western-style wedding ceremony, you have typically a bride who is separated from the rest of the group. The groom also would be separated, but would eventually come out. And then the bride is walked down the aisle by family members, typically her father, and then passed to the groom. And the ceremony goes from there. There's other ways we could be looking at gender in the traditional marriage ceremony, but even just that part of it shows us a kind of reinforcement of an understanding that a woman passes from ownership from her father to her husband. And there's a lot of aspects of the traditional marriage ceremony that embed such ideas regarding gender in it. And in this way, by performing the ceremony, there's an aspect of that belief that gets maintained. So That's one example of how a symbolic action can be ritual, and that can work to maintain the social order. Now, of course, a ritual could be used to transform it as well. So ritual is, by definition, patterned and done with a similar procedure every time, but that doesn't mean it goes the same every single time. People do change traditions and rituals, and the Western-style marriage ceremony is one. Not everybody goes ahead and follows through with the traditional aspects of the ceremony that have more of this gendered approach to them. When we're talking about social action and symbolic actions, social change, you have to remember that this is a group project. It's collective. We like to think about change specifically as involving revolutions and rebellions, but as I was just mentioning, we have to keep in mind that there's a lot that goes into also maintaining the status quo. And with all of this happening, while there might be figureheads and leaders, it always takes a collective, it is a collective activity to either transform or maintain society. So we want to think of social change as a process. Starting to talk about this a bit last week when we talked about the notion of progress and it's the problematic aspects of progress, and how instead we want to think of not progress but just change. And specifically we want to think about change in terms of process. So change isn't happening towards something. It's a process. It's a continuous unfolding and changing nature, a phenomenon over time. Think of biological evolution as a process. And we talked about some of the misconceptions about that last week as well. And what processes lack that distinguishes them from something like an idea of progress is that there's not a mark that is the finish line. It's continuing and it's always ongoing. You can think of a process or social change as process like a wave. An ocean wave has form, but it's always being remade, and the droplets are replacing other droplets, and there's a movement happening, and it might sort of move in a direction, but it's a very constant flow that's never ending. To remember that culture only exists in being done. So part of our definition of culture involves practices. Culture is a practice, so we do culture. When you think of something that happens, such as a death in the community, new actors replace the old, and they always change the practices in some way. Over time, the meanings and physical doings of practices change. And it doesn't only have to be death that brings this kind of change. It can be someone who takes a new position in the culture when someone else retires or something like that. Anyway, all of this is to bring us to this point that culture is embodied. It means that it has a physical component, and it's not just abstract in our mind. By speaking, gesturing, sitting in certain ways, we're all doing culture. I always think of education classrooms when I'm thinking about examples of embodiment. But it's what we do all the time. And over time, the meanings of physical doings and practices can change too. So one example that one of my teachers used to always talk about that I think is a good one is thinking about transition that occurred in rock music. So in the 1960s, you had the Beatles, still with a pretty traditional format, drummer, bass, guitar, singer, and lyrics still fairly traditional in many ways. And if you see images of them performing at that time, they're wearing suits, they're standing very still, and it's very different from what happened to them or how they would perform later in their careers. 1967, the Velvet Underground came onto the scene, another band, but they brought in some other traditions, classical and other types of traditions, and they performed in ways that nobody expected, and they changed what everyone thought was actually possible in rock and roll. And future bands were highly influenced by them as well. So the genre didn't get changed into another genre, but they transformed it by giving another option of what could be possible within the genre. And the whole genre shifted as well to where you get later Beatles, and they very different from how they started out. So the example is just meant to show us that changes are happening all the time, and moment to moment they can be hard to see, but if we step back, we might be able to see them over time. And every time we have something like a ritual, it doesn't go exactly the same every time. We try to make it be as much as possible, but there's always something that will differentiate it from a previous one or the next one. And that's an aspect of change as well. There's another example that I'd like to bring your attention to about neurasthenia. So when we think of medical anthropology, this is a great example. So neurasthenia is this condition with symptoms of fatigue, anxiety, headache, impotence, and depression. And the concept of this disease was tied to a model of how the brain functioned, thought of as having a dry brain, that it worked on electrical currents. And if you were in occupations that were highly intellectually or emotionally taxing, these currents could get drained. So people in intellectual stratas of society, elites in business, for example, were diagnosed with this. Sigmund Freud and William James were both diagnosed with this, actually. And it was seen as a physical ailment of the upper class. Only the elite suffered from it. And they would have treatment, go to the mountains or the countryside, sit outside, and just rest, basically take a vacation. And this became unpopular as a medical category because first people were more interested in describing neurasthenia and mental illnesses as psychosexually caused, and so the whole basis for its causality shifted, and people became more interested in finding scientific causes for illness as well. So this category really became unpopular in the West, but surprisingly it was adopted in China in the 1980s. Doctors were using this category, were trained in Western medicine, but it turned out it was a good fit for Chinese cultural ideas about the mind-body connection, and aligned in many ways with Chinese ideas about qi. In the Red Revolution in China, neurasthenia was seen as a sign of the Western contagion or influence. There was an idea that it was brought in from the outside, and it had a representation tied to it being a political divergence. So we can see how even within the society and the time it was being used, there was this interesting cultural interpretation of neurasthenia. And then the fact that it was the same definition of disease being applied in very different ways shows us cultural processes occurring, not some kind of unidirectional progress, but simply a process of change. So this reemphasizes what we talked about last week as well, about how we can't use progress to talk about social change because it's so subjective. Instead, we have to be talking about change, and specifically understanding change as a kind of process that has no end point and it has a constant ebb and flow to it.